Hello and welcome everyone to our 53rd session of HalloCasa. My name is Michael and today I'm talking to Morgan McGilvray from Manila, Makati City in the Philippines. Morgan is originally from the US, from California, and has now been living for several years in the Philippines. Morgan, welcome to the show. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Michael, thank you for having me. Hello to the audience. Yeah, so as mentioned, I am from California originally. I've been living in the Philippines for over 10 years. 9 of those 10 years, I've been working in the real estate industry. I work for a firm called Santos Knight Frank, which is the Knight Frank affiliate office of the Philippines. I do office leasing, so I usually represent tenants who want to lease office space, either in Metro Manila or in the provinces of the Philippines. I originally came here because I got introduced to the Philippine call center industry back when I lived in California in 2003. The firm I worked for was already using a Philippine call center a long time before Philippine call centers got really popular.
Mhm.
I began working with the Filipinos. In 2005, I did a working vacation to Manila. Really enjoyed my time here. Was really impressed by the work that the Filipino agents were doing for us. I made multiple trips here. Eventually, I met my wife,
Mhm.
who was from here.
Mhm.
And as I was an unemployed grad student in 2009, I
Yeah.
decided to spend some time in Manila, just waiting for the global financial crisis to kind of go away.
Yeah.
And while here, I got fortunate enough to get a job interview and then eventually an offer from my firm. So I've been doing real estate here ever since.
Awesome. How is life in Manila?
I love it. And I think you'll meet a lot of people, expats here, who really like the lifestyle. It's an interesting mix of being very chaotic, but
Mhm.
then relaxed at the same time. And what I mean by that is Manila is one of the densest cities in the world. So
Mhm.
there are so many people. Estimates have it up to 20 million people in the greater Manila area, um, condensed into the city that's the size of Chicago.
Mhm.
And so, because of so many people, there's so much activity, there's so much traffic, there's people's on the streets, there's generally people everywhere. And so, you have to get used to that when moving here, especially if you come from somewhere that's a little bit more rural or a little bit slower paced. So,
Mhm.
that's the hectic side. But the calming, the relaxing side is that the Filipino people are generally laid back, they're incredibly friendly. They're incredibly friendly to expats, such as me.
Mhm.
And I really like the working culture. I like the office culture a lot. I don't feel stressed here the way I might back home in the US or other places. So I've really enjoyed that part of it.
Awesome. You mentioned before that you're especially like focused on the BPO market, on this outsourcing market, but also on the offshore market for global Fortune 500 companies. Is Manila the only spot and the only big city which people leverage, or are there more cities in the Philippines which are also used?
Yeah, so Manila has about 85% of the office leasing activity. So it
Mhm.
really is a strong number one.
Mhm.
Second place would be Cebu City or Metro Cebu,
Mhm.
which has probably about 10% of the market.
Mhm.
And then the remaining 5% are scattered into other cities throughout the Philippines. The ones that are becoming globally popular are the Clark area, north of
Mhm.
Metro Manila, Davao City, Iloilo City, and a few others, which we call next wave cities, which are the up and coming BPO markets in the country.
Okay. In fact, can you give us a little bit of an overview of this entire emergence of it? Because you mentioned before you started a little bit like, oh, you were actually at the crisp of the start of the entire BPO market. How's that evolved, and what's also the start of it?
Yeah, so I worked from the client side, and that
Mhm.
was my first exposure to the BPO industry. When I came here in 2005, the industry was just getting started. Really, you could say that you could trace it back to when the proper internet cables were laid into Manila, and you kind of had that T1
Mhm.
speed of internet connection, which allowed voice over internet type of calling rather than long distance landline calling. And
Mhm.
I think that was really what's described as the catalyst for starting Manila as a call center destination. In 2005, the industry was limited to just a few buildings Just a few providers, many of which don't even exist anymore. They've been merged or bought up or whatnot.
Hmm.
But you really had, the best that the Philippine labor force had to offer. You had these really intelligent, hardworking college graduates who were attracted to these call center jobs because they were paying well.
Hmm.
They were located in the big cities. And generally, for when there weren't other opportunities, the agents were drawn to these jobs. And so, even though the pay rate were comparatively low at the time, and pay has gotten quite a bit bigger since then, um, they were offering great value because you were getting the smartest Filipinos at really competitive rates, and U.S. companies, took advantage of that. And as the word spread, we continued to see more and more firms starting to check out the Philippines.
Hmm.
Now, the industry really started with what we like to call third party call centers. So these are businesses who specialize in providing call center agents to different companies.
Hmm.
So a third party call center would often have anywhere from 5 to 50 clients.
Hmm.
And each client is a company like the one I was working for, who's based somewhere outside the Philippines
Hmm.
and is basically asking the call center to say, okay, well, we'd like to have 20 agents servicing our shipment tracking.
Hmm.
And so the call center would say, okay, well, we'll interview and hire the 20 agents and we will charge you X and X dollars per agent per month.
Hmm.
And we'll take care of the management, the real estate, and pretty much everything else. So you can just offshore and outsource this work to
Hmm.
us. And that's how the industry started. But over time, we started to see that companies would come over here and rather than use a third party call center, they would set up their own call center operation.
Okay.
And we often call those captive BPOs.
Hmm.
Um, and that means that all the agents actually work for the company. So let's say Citibank. They
Hmm.
might have a few thousand agents in Manila, and the agents are doing nothing but servicing Citibank as an entity. So they might be doing the back office accounting work, the HR work, could be a lot of different functions, but it's all within Citi itself.
Okay.
And that is becoming increasingly popular in the market. So eventually, a lot of firms decide that at a certain scale, they would rather have their own call center and all the advantages that come with it rather than use the third party. And so we're seeing a lot more parity between these captive BPOs versus what used to be the most popular, which was the third party call
Yeah,
centers.
got it. And where does Santos Knight Frank come and play there?
Yeah. So we are a real estate services provider.
Hmm.
We compete against firms like CBRE, Jones Lang LaSalle, Cushman Wakefield, et cetera.
Hmm.
And so the services we provide to our clients, in my case, I do tenant representation. So if one of these clients wants to lease in a new office building, renew their lease, expand, et cetera, they bring me in as a consultant. I represent them. I help negotiate help them choose a building, help them negotiate the lease, et cetera.
Hmm.
But we offer a lot more than that. We also do residential brokerage. So if they have, let's say, some managers flying in who need a place to live, we can help them find a place to live. If they need their facilities, let's say in the captive center, if they need the facilities managed, whether that be janitorial, reception, air conditioned, technician, et cetera, we do that.
Hmm.
If a building owner themselves need the building managed, we do property management.
Hmm.
We value properties. We do consultation work, advisory on what's the best use for a piece of land. So pretty much anything involving real estate and a service we get into. The only things we don't do are we don't own buildings, we don't purchase assets, we only do services.
Got it. So you're the go-to guy if I want to set up my company or my office in somewhere in the Philippines, office space, and I would like to have like someone there making sure that everything is running smoothly and the office is like more or less like well equipped, and then you can help me.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So a lot of my clients are considering trying the Philippines. And so I'll meet up with them early and we'll talk about the different regions of the country. We'll
Mhm.
talk about budget. We'll talk about what they need out of, let's say, facilities. What quality building do they need? What hours are they going to operate, et cetera, et cetera. And I just do a lot of advisory work, helping them to choose their
Mhm.
location and then possibly to choose a building and the appropriate amount of space to lease.
Absolutely. Do you have any other hubs where you say, okay, if you want to go into this market or if you need office space in this sector, maybe also considering obviously employees, which you later on might need, do Do you have any? Can you give us an overview of maybe some business hubs outside of maybe within and also outside of Manila to get an idea of yes, there are some interesting hubs for each particular topic or for each particular profession or even emerging hubs and just interesting right now.
Sure. So within Metro Manila, there are six office markets that we track,
Mhm.
six central business districts, if you will. The most popular is probably called the Bonifacio Global City, which is actually a pretty new district. It really started only in 2005. And in the last 15 years, it's gone from 0 square meters to about 1.3 million square meters of office space in just
Wow.
15 years. So it's master planned, it's all brand new, it's all grade A type material. And the Bonifacio Global City has been very popular, especially with the captives. And the reason is that it is a truly an international city. It's world class in terms of the infrastructure, the buildings, etc. And for a lot of the captives who are really going for the grade A blue chip talent in the Philippines, they like to go into the Bonifacio Global City because of the prestige involved there
Mhm.
and the fact that it's easiest to attract the highest value add Philippine workers to
Mhm.
go there.
Mhm.
So if they're not too budget constrained, that's quite a popular location.
Mhm.
Before Bonifacio Global City kind of became the premier business district, Makati City, which is where I'm based,
Mhm.
probably was that. Makati was a bit of a mix of the old and the new. But when the call centers first started up in the early 2000s, most of them were located in Makati City because that's where you could find the office buildings that had space available to lease to them.
Mhm.
We've continued to see development in a lot of the biggest captive firms. Think Macquarie, the Australian bank. Citibank was here for decades, etc. They've been in Makati, and some of them still remain here in Makati. And it's a prime district as well.
Mhm.
Then we get into kind of maybe what we'd call the second tier districts of Metro Manila. Some
Mhm.
names include the Ortigas Central Business District, Quezon City, and Alabang. And those tend to be called the second tier districts because they are notably less expensive in terms of rent and building maintenance dues, etc. And we tend to get companies who are a little bit more budget conscious, who feel like they don't need to impress with the location or the quality of their building,
Mhm.
often because they don't have clients visiting them, or they're not necessarily going for the top market talent.
Yeah.
Instead, they're looking for cost efficiencies, and so they might go into somewhere like an Ortigas business district or another one called the Alabang district because you get 25 to 50% rental savings. You're often actually located closer to where the employees themselves live, which is a
Mhm.
nice plus, especially given the traffic problems we sometimes have here in Manila.
Yeah.
And generally, the districts are modern enough, safe enough, and clean enough to where everyone feels comfortable. And
Mhm.
that's not only the employees that work there. I think oftentimes it's the company themselves, the managers or the people who are in charge of setting up the project. They want a certain level of comfort too with
Yeah.
where they're going to be leasing. And if they don't feel comfortable in an area, then they probably won't choose that area for their employees. And so that's why we see a lot of companies start up in kind of the second tier districts, but still within Metro Manila because the comfort is there, the people are there, the infrastructure is there. They're just looking to not pay necessarily top dollar in rent.
Got it. Got it. Considering the future of the office real estate market in Manila and also maybe other cities, where do you see what for trends do you see within the next few years?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had a very recent trend in this market since late 2016.
Mhm.
And it's called POGO, POGO. It stands for Philippine Offshore Gaming Operator.
Mhm.
And what it actually means is it's online gambling. And so we've had companies come over here and operate websites that cater to gambling communities in other countries around the world.
Okay.
And that started in 2016 because the current president of the Philippines, President Duterte, signed into law that firms like that would be allowed to operate here as long as they were properly licensed.
Mhm.
And so, from about late 2016 until today, we've seen a massive influx of firms who want to run offshore gaming operations here. We estimate now that about 1 million square meters have been leased by this industry. That's about 10% of the overall market.
Hmm.
And the estimates vary, but somewhere between probably 200,000 up to 800,000 uh, people have flown in, many of them from mainland China, to work in this industry.
Wow.
And so, yeah, you can imagine it's really a popular conversation topic. And I've spoken to multiple chambers of commerce about it because a lot of people have questions
Yeah.
about why we have so many people all of a sudden on the streets of Manila and what is this pogo industry they keep asking about. So that really has had a major impact on the market over the last, let's say, 3 years. And what's interesting now is because of this coronavirus, flights between the mainland China, Hong Kong, and Macau have been discontinued coming in and out of Manila.
Hmm.
And so the industry now is having a real trouble getting employees, either new employees or employees who happen to be back in China. They
Hmm.
can't get entrance back into the Philippines.
Wow.
And so these firms have rented office space and their employees are stuck in the mainland for as long as there is a moratorium on flights. And so that's probably going to have a notable impact on the market. It'll probably slow the growth of that particular industry. And we've seen growth in the hundreds of thousands of square meters over the last few years. And for the growth like that to continue, you need to continue to be able to bring in employees to fill these jobs, which is becoming tougher. So, my prediction for probably the next 12 months is that growth in that industry, office take up in that industry will probably slow a bit.
Mhm.
But we hope that the BPO industry outside of these pogos continues to be strong and
Mhm.
can pick up some of the slack.
Yeah. Okay, great. Super interesting that and great that you mentioned the entire impact on the coronavirus, which apparently you definitely right now like experience. Um, I have another question concerning cities outside of Manila. You mentioned before Cebu and Davao.
Mhm.
Um, can you talk a little bit about those cities as also interesting destinations in the office space market?
Sure. So Cebu is really an established district. Certainly the largest outside of Metro Manila. It's probably over 1 million square meters by now.
Hmm.
And a lot of the firms who have operations in Metro Manila might also have a secondary office in Cebu.
Hmm.
Firms generally like Cebu for a couple reasons. One are the English language skills. So Filipinos who are from Cebu or the surrounding areas tend to learn English sometimes as a second language before they even learn Tagalog, which is the national
Hmm.
dialect, if you will, of the Philippines. So they've got really strong English skills in Cebu, and that attracts a lot of the companies, especially the voice-based call centers and captive BPOs who
Hmm.
need a lot of speaking skills. The rents and the salaries have tended to be lower, somewhere between 20 to 40% less than a lot of places in Metro Manila. So there are cost benefits. Really, just access to the labor pool. So the million or so plus people who live in Cebu and the surrounding area. Plus, there are a lot of other islands here in the Philippines where young adults who finish their university often go to the main cities to look for work. And so
Hmm.
Cebu tends to be a magnet to the surrounding Philippine islands as well for attracting call center talent.
Hmm.
And for those reasons, Cebu has been a very strong district and a very strong alternative to Metro Manila for, let's say, the past 15 plus years. Now, compare that, I guess, to Davao. Now, Davao is in the Mindanao region of the Philippines. Davao happens to be the city where the current president was the mayor for almost 3 decades. It is probably the third largest city in the Philippines, but it's only a small percentage of the size of Metro Manila. Only, yeah, probably, I don't even know if it's 1 million anymore. I'd have to check that.
Hmm.
But it has a very comparatively small office market. So we haven't seen a lot of firms go down into Davao quite yet. That is changing. And the reason it's changing, I think there are a few reasons, really. One is that as Metro Manila and Cebu tend to feel a bit more and more saturated, more and more call center operators there, and there's only so many employees to go after. There's only so many office buildings that can be filled. Firms continue to reach out and try new areas, what they call a greenfield strategy here, looking for new labor pools, looking for lower costs, etc. And so Davao would be one of the areas that firms would often look into. And what's I think prevented them from going down there in more significant numbers in the past is that the infrastructure and the office buildings weren't quite there, not up to the
Hmm.
standards that a lot of these firms needed. What's changed is that the biggest developers in this country have actually considered and built in Davao now. So we're getting kind of Manila grade A quality buildings in the city of Davao, and that's being supported by infrastructure upgrades as well. And so all of a sudden, places like Davao become more and more viable because the contact centers or the captives can go down there and they can say, oh, okay, well, this is a high quality building. The residential, the hospitals, everything is surrounding it. I love the rents. I love the salaries. We should consider this area. And so we're starting to see that quite a bit.
Okay, that's super interesting, and I think it's super valuable to have someone like you there locally to also conduct exactly those market researches and to really make sure that you know exactly like where to go and stuff. I assume that if I have a company and I say like I really would like to consider the Philippines, you also give me exactly like the way you said before, like you're giving me this consultancy service, saying what do you need, how do I approach it? What is exactly like the best location? Um, Going back a little bit to your services, can you walk me through the process of what I have to consider if I approach you, and what would be the steps in order to finally have a decent, let's say, office space, which also obviously fulfill my requirements. How's the process, and how can I imagine that?
Yeah. So you don't need to know too much. That's the good news. So if you
Mhm.
have interest in the Philippines, what I'd normally like to hear is, do you have any preferred areas in mind, or are you kind of approaching the project with an open mind, saying, wherever is recommended is where we'll consider?
Mhm.
And then from there, I'd probably want to know kind of what budget are you thinking, and that can be expressed in terms of rent or just overall. I'd be thinking, okay, what services are you trying to provide here? Does it require voice communication or is it just data entry?
Mhm.
Because that will also dictate which locations we might want to consider. I'll ask you things like, have you set aside a large budget to design your own office space, or would
Mhm.
you prefer move into a previously used office space to save on initial capital expenditure?
Mhm.
I'd ask, okay, how many agents are you thinking about, and do you plan to grow that over time?
Mhm.
Because we'd want to choose a solution that's flexible, that lets you scale up or even scale down without any long-term or firm commitments.
Mhm.
Um, that's usually how I get going. I'd usually refer these companies, historically, I would have referred them to research the PEZA program. That's PEZA, Philippine Export Zone Authority, or Philippine Economic Zone Authority, which has been a government tax incentive scheme offered
Mhm.
to a lot of the call centers, which almost all of them take advantage of. And there have been tremendous tax benefits, including income tax free holidays, value added tax exemptions. And so I'd strongly advise my clients to look into that program, see if they feel it's a fit for them. And
Mhm.
if so, that could also dictate our office search. Because if they want to participate in the program, that's great. But it also means that they'd have to locate in a office building that is accredited by the same program.
Okay. Okay, so you don't even, it's not only like contingent on the services you are providing, but also on the location.
Yeah, I think location matters.
Mhm.
What I tend to find is that companies who are trying out the Philippines for the first time tend to choose somewhere in Metro Manila.
Mhm.
And I think that's just from a comfort perspective.
Mhm.
They feel most comfortable with the labor pool, with the infrastructure, etc. What then happens is once they are up and running in Metro Manila, that's when they tend to think about a second or third site outside of the metro.
Mhm.
And usually, again, it's to access new labor markets, or they want to bring in maybe a lower cost service. So, like data entry, for example.
Mhm.
Usually, it's more about cost savings with a role like that. So being in a prime district in Metro Manila doesn't make sense. So I might talk to them about the provincial areas where maybe language skills aren't quite as important, but the wages are a bit lower, the rents are a bit lower, and you could get data entry services done for the least amount of cost. Yeah, so we don't see a lot of companies go straight into the provinces because they already feel that they're taking a bit of a risk trying the
Yeah,
Philippines in the first place, so they don't want to pile risk on top of risk.
yeah.
But once they get here, try it and love it, then they tend to go outside of the metro more.
Yeah, I have to say, a few months back, I had the privilege to travel to the Philippines. I was super impressed. I really like it, and I definitely want to go back. I think like people are super likable, super open-minded, super friendly, and even though I wouldn't see any like huge obstacles culture-wise, especially me being also well, being from Europe, so there's also no religious huge difference. Still, I totally agree. I think it's always good like to have like one anchor in the main hub, and then from go from there, and then explore a little bit like the further outside to say, okay, what else is there, and maybe some more interesting spots to find more, yeah, to find
Yeah,
nicer spots maybe.
yeah.
Um, I have another. Well, for me, like super interesting is the way you see also regard the entire WeWork and co-working space movement. I know it's not like your core business, I assume. However, do you are you impacted by this trend that companies prefer not to have like their own office space and say, okay, I'm still a startup. I prefer to use a WeWork or to use another co-working space.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So there's WeWork, and I can talk about that. And then there's almost a separate answer for companies who want to come in and not have their own office space right away, but
Hmm.
also not necessarily go into a WeWork in the sense of a co-working solution where, they're sharing office space with a bunch of other companies. So I'll start with WeWork and just co-working in the Philippines in general. So WeWork came to the Philippines a little bit later than other countries. They
Hmm.
came in a couple years ago, but they've grown quite quickly. Last I checked, they have over 50,000 square meters throughout the Philippines, spread over maybe 5 or 6 office buildings.
Hmm.
And they have been doing very well from what I can tell. So their centers, I think, have leased out very well. They've taken some large spaces and they've tend to fill it up. I know that's not true in all their markets in the world. And in fact, in some places, they're scaling down. But here in the Philippines, I think is probably still one of their growth markets.
Hmm.
And I think, you can attribute that to probably the same as in a lot of other markets. There just really is a need for individuals and small companies who don't want to lease their own office space, but also don't want to work out of a Starbucks. Uh, WeWork and other co-working operators here in the Philippines makes a lot of sense for them, and I think that's been going well, especially because there's a lot of entrepreneur and startups in the Philippines. It very much is an entrepreneurial culture, and so you do get a lot of firms that aren't really that large yet, but still want to be in an office environment, and so they choose co-working. And we say that maybe 5 to 10% of the new office leases in this market are going to co-working firms,
Hmm.
whether it's WeWork or Common Ground. There are a lot of them. There are probably over 30 providers now. Um, but they have been coming in. They've all been showing a lot of interest in the Philippines. We're just waiting to see, is there going to be an oversupply in co-working?
Yeah.
And that's possible. We will find that out probably in the next 1 to 2 years, especially if firms start to close up because they just didn't fill up the way they'd hoped. But for now, it's mostly been a growth industry.
Okay.
But there's a different industry, a sub industry, if you will, and that caters more to the call centers. And there is one firm called KMC Solutions. They are probably the largest provider in this market. There are a few others that I generally recommend. Fagari Solutions is another name I'll throw out there. And what these firms do is they kind of serve like a WeWork, but to the call center industry.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is these firms often will lease out and build out offices, and then they will lease by the seat and by the month to companies who are entering the Philippines.
Hmm.
But this differs from the third party call centers that I spoke about earlier in the sense that these providers nowadays, these seat leasing providers, they don't do the hiring, they don't do the management. They just provide the seats,
Hmm.
the technology, etc. But they don't get into the HR of it all. So the firm can lease 50 seats, but the firm itself is in control of how they run their operations here in Manila.
Mm.
And that model has been popular because, as I said, sometimes companies come here and they're a little cautious. They don't want to make a large 5-year lease commitment. They don't want to spend half a million or $1 million US to fit out an office space if they're not sure that setting up in the Philippines is going to work.
Yeah.
So they'd rather sign up on a 6-month commitment and just pay a higher rental rate per seat than they might otherwise in order to have that flexibility. And what ends up happening usually is, rather than shutting down or not like in the Philippines, they end up loving it more than they expected. And they want to go from 50 seats to 150 to 200 within the first 6 to 12 months of getting started here. And if they were in a traditional office space, that can be tough because it's hard to grow that quickly. It's not always guaranteed you're going to find more space within your existing building, et cetera. So sometimes these seat providing agencies, they can allow more flexibility to go scale up from 50 to 100 to 150 seats in a short amount of time because the seats are already built. They're just ready to be rented. And so firms often grow that way. We sometimes call them incubator sites.
Mhm.
And then eventually, if you hit a certain scale, let's say 200 agents, 250 agents, sometimes then it makes sense to move out of the incubator and take your own office space once you're a little more sure of how big you want your operation to be here and you're ready to kind of take over the entirety of the space under your own lease.
Makes total sense. Sounds super flexible, and then you can ramp up the way you would like to afterwards.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, I think it's super interesting what you have been talking about. You just mentioned the entrepreneurial mindset of the Filipinos. You said they're very entrepreneurial. What's the origin? Why is that so? And also, where do you see that going?
Yeah. So why is it that way? I mean, maybe the easy answer would just say it's in the culture,
Mhm.
but I'm not sure I can exactly explain what about the culture it is,
Mhm.
other than the Filipino culture, in addition to being friendly and team oriented and creative. I think the English language skills, Filipinos generally very excellent in speaking English. That really helps because if you're an entrepreneur and generally you're selling to the world nowadays,
Mhm.
if you're running a website and your market is the whole world, well, certainly fluency in English and the ability to work in English and have clients throughout the world that you can speak to in English, that's a big plus, right? And you might not get that in, let's say, certain places within China or Spanish speaking countries where,
Mhm.
there's only so many, quality English speakers and maybe they're already employed. So you don't get so many entrepreneurs like that. So I think that explains a bit about the Filipinos here, but equally important and worth mentioning is how many entrepreneur expats there are in the Philippines.
Mhm.
So a lot of people come to the Philippines to start up a business, and I think a lot of the times that's cost based. So the entrepreneurs feel like they can set up almost anywhere in the world because again they're running a website.
Mhm.
Location isn't that important for the sake of their business, so they say, okay, well, where can I keep my costs really low but still be in a place that I'll really enjoy living and be able to hire from a quality talent pool. And
Mhm.
the Philippines makes perfect sense for that. And so we get a lot of entrepreneurs who come in and are starting up different kinds of websites. And they do it out of Manila just because it makes a lot of sense from them. It keeps their costs low. They enjoy living here, lots of English being spoken, and
Mhm.
generally a friendly culture for that kind of thing.
Mhm. Um, uh, I mean, I think there are definitely some spillover effects, as you say. Like if you see like a lot of expats coming to the market, you definitely also have like some effects on the entire society going to the Philippines, and then they might see it, and then they go after that as well. Um, Concerning well, in fact, for me, it is super interesting having talked to you. Do you have any final thoughts for the audience?
Wow. Well, I'd continue to encourage people to have an outsourcing solution.
Mhm.
I think most businesses around the world is incredibly popular in the US, Australia, and it's becoming popular in Europe
Mhm.
to have operations outside of the home country.
Mhm.
And there can be a variety of reasons for that. But One thing we always like to ask companies and potential clients is, what is your outsourcing or what is your offshoring solution? And if
Hmm.
they don't have one yet, we'd really encourage them to look into it, because chances are their competitors probably do have one, and their competitors are probably benefiting from having an outsourcing solution. And that could be because they found a way to provide lower costs on certain services, or they found a way to have business continuity in the event of a problem in the home country, et cetera. So we encourage companies to look into that. And then, of course, we encourage companies to look into the Philippines as an outsourcing or offshoring destination. As I've mentioned, you've got a very talented English speaking workforce here. The costs, both in terms of salaries, real estate, et cetera, is often a small percentage of what you'd pay in more of the developed and big cities around the world. Even companies who have to send managers over, the managers tend to be happy living here, which is quite good. And when if looking into the Philippines, well, don't do it alone. Find consultants, and
Yeah.
I'm often a good consultant, but you'll need HR consultants, and there's really a variety of consultancies that are specializing in helping companies get introduced to the Philippines and get started up. So there's no shortage of help there. Again, if you for your real estate solutions, me and then my company, Santos Knight Frank, we're here to help. We have a very long client list of people who we could refer for recommendations and advice and whatnot as well. So it's as simple as just finding us and telling us what you're thinking about.
Awesome. Um, Thank you so much. If people want to contact you, how can they do that? How can they contact directly Morgan McGilvray?
Yeah, it's my name is a bit tricky, so
Hmm.
usually I prefer to write down my email address
Hmm.
at santosnightfrank.ph. So I'm hoping that maybe somewhere on your site or linked
Absolutely.
to this video, we can just put my email address, and email's probably the best way to get me, and then we can go from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Morgan.
Oh, it's great.
Obviously, I will put all the information down. I learned a lot about the office space in the Philippines and Manila, and thank you so much for your deep dive into the entire market, also the BPO market, captive, but also outsourcing wise, third party providers. Super interesting. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for this great session. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for the opportunity. I enjoyed it.
Have a nice day. Bye bye.
All right, cheers. Bye bye.